world hangs on a thin thread, and that is the psyche of man. We are not threatened by elementary catastrophes. There is no such thing as an H-bomb. That is all man's doing. Yeah. We are the great danger. Psyche is the great danger.
In this video series, I want to explore Carl Jung's collected works and offer not only a summary of each chapter, but also kind of a guide that you can refer to if you're confused about topics in the chapters. I know that it's unrealistic for a lot of people to read Carl Jung's work, as not only is it difficult to read, but it oftentimes assumes that the reader comes to his work having read his other work or being very well versed in the terminology of psychoanalysis. There's also the fact that Carl Jung's work is expansive. I was just looking today, it's like 16,000 pages of work that he has published in his collected works. And so, like I said, it's unrealistic for the average person to read all of his books and get a full understanding of his theories. I don't think that a video series like this would ever replace actually engaging with his works, but I do think it could be a solid substitute for people who wouldn't have read his collected works anyways. I first want to say that I am a graduate student of clinical psychology, and I've studied Carl Jung specifically now for the past 3 years. At Columbia, there is a Jungian analyst that teaches a lot of the clinical psych courses, and I've taken all of his courses, and I've gotten to be the course assistant. This will now be the second year for the introductory class to analytical psychology. It's really been an insane experience learning and having my worldview shift around so much. Each time I go through the class, even though it's the same class with the same professor, I learn like an exponentially more amount of information I learned from the previous classes. And so I also want this to be a resource for myself in a way that I can kind of summarize what I've learned in those classes, but also have it be a resource for other people looking into analytical psychology. And so now I want to briefly mention why we're starting with what is, I think, his 5th or 6th book that he published instead of one of the first ones he published. 2 Essays on Analytical Psychology really represents Carl Jung's first attempt at really formalizing his new theory of psychology. And for this reason, many people will point towards it as the best book that you can read as an introduction to his concepts. As you're probably aware, Jung and Freud worked together for a very long time, but ended their relationship due to disagreements about the nature of the unconscious.
You know, from the beginning I had a reservatio mentalis. I couldn't agree with quite a number of his ideas. His disregard of the historical conditions of man. We are shaped through education, through the influence of the parents, which are by no means always personal. And we are not of today or of yesterday. We are of an immense age.
This led Jung into a long period of depression and introspection, where he authored the Red Book. The Red Book is actually a condensed version of his own personal journals, in which he says he experienced confrontations with the unconscious. People call them hallucinations or delusions or visions. The Red Book, which we may get into at a later point, is very imagistic, very metaphorical. And what's important to note is that these experiences are the bedrock of his future theories that he develops. I mention this because Jung, as we will see unfold, is aiming at something that is partially outside the scientific framework. In the Red Book, his concepts are alive, they are fluid, they are poetic, they are mythical. In his collected works, he has purposely tried to render them in a way that is accessible to the average reader and that somewhat fits within the scientific framework. But we absolutely have to keep in mind, as we progress with the series, that this is only one rendition of Jung's knowledge and experiences. The Red Book is the original raw material. Reflecting on the Red Book, he says, "All my works, all my creative activity has come from those initial fantasies and dreams which began in 1912. So this is in reference to him beginning to author the Black Books in 1912. So throughout this series, I will do my best to keep the concepts alive as they should be. And I will do this by trying to include art, poetry, different images, and things like that. You might ask yourself, why is it that we even have to go outside the scientific framework to build a system of psychology? This is not the video that will argue for that perspective. I have other videos that relate to it. But what I do want to mention is that by Gödel's theorem, any system of axioms that you construct will have blind spots. And those blind spots represent truths that are irrational. So irrational truths that are outside of a logical framework, if that's the framework you're operating in, which is certainly the scientific one. So with that being said, with that being covered, that is the introduction to the series and the introduction to the book. So now let's look at the first chapter, titled Psychoanalysis. So I will say this and I will stand by it, that psychoanalysis is the most important theory in the history of psychology. And it's not because it was correct, but it's really because it was first. There's a reason why every book begins with a commentary on psychoanalysis or some kind of reference to Freud. And it's not that Freud was even the first to think about some of the concepts that he mentions. It's that he's the first to render it in such a way that it at least somewhat fit within the scientific framework of the time. In my classes, we refer to Freud as being the Christopher Columbus of the mind, and especially of the unconscious. But just like Christopher Columbus, he is the first to end up on this completely new frontier and begin to organize it and categorize it and declare different rules and things like that. Jung has a very important place in the history of psychoanalysis given his relationship to Freud. He was commonly referred to as the best psychoanalyst, and Freud saw him as a son, bestowed upon Jung the responsibility of continuing what he called the sexual theory, which is his theory of psychosexuality, and is the bedrock for psychoanalysis. So here in the first chapter, we see Carl Jung give a brief history of the events leading up to the development of psychoanalysis and how his theories differ from it. In many courses, you'll see that psychoanalysis, the history of it, begins with Charcot and this very famous image. Charcot was actually a hypnotist who treated primarily women who suffered from hysteria. Common hysterical symptoms included blindness and hearing loss, seizures, amnesia, paralysis, fainting, chronic pain, loss of sensation in limbs or body parts, hallucinations, and these autonomous bodily postures. Charcot was actually famous for designating the hysterical arch as the defining feature of hysteria. Hysteria today has actually been differentiated into many different disorders, including conversion disorders and different personality disorders, primarily borderline personality disorder. The main thing that comes out of this line of work is this infamous line: all hysterical symptoms could be produced through suggestion. So what these hypnotists would do is stimulate the individual's transformation into an altered state of consciousness, and usually it's through some type of relaxation. Many people have their own opinions on being hypnotized. There's one thing that we can't neglect about it is that it's real. People experience it. I know people that I genuinely trust that have been hypnotized. I've never been hypnotized. Some people are more susceptible to it than others, but it's certainly a real thing, a real possibility. So what they observed in these altered states is that the person was no longer themselves. Instead, they were much more suggestible, but most importantly, they exhibited a different and consistent set of memories. So eventually, two huge conclusions come out of this vein in hypnotists trying to treat hysteria. One is what I just mentioned. They have a consistent memory in that state. So you hypnotize somebody, bring them into that state, and you can start populating that with memories. It might just be memories of the conversation you're having with them. When they are then brought back into their normal state of consciousness, they won't remember that conversation. But months could go by and you hypnotize them again in the same way, and that conversation will be recovered and they'll remember it only in that state. Right? And this is something that seems so foreign to us, so foreign to reality, but I do want to mention that we kind of do it in sleep every night. We go to bed, we alter our consciousness and our awareness, we populate our mind with these different experiences and memories. They kind of stay consistent throughout our lives. The second big thing that was discovered in this vein was that by implanting bad memories or experiences, they can actually create hysterical symptoms in the waking state. They can also resolve symptoms in the waking state by suggestion in the altered state. I'm going to reiterate, the big thing that these theorists discover is that hysterical symptoms can be both cured and created by the hypnotist. Into the scene comes Breuer, who's a pupil of Charcot and will eventually be the mentor of Freud. What he noticed is that once he converted the individual into the altered suggestible state and he conversed with them about their trauma, specifically focusing on the imagery that would arise, symptoms would resolve in the waking state, sometimes for days at a time. So as I mentioned before, we're talking somebody coming into your office, they're blind or deaf or paralyzed. Use hypnosis to alter their state. You focus on the imagery that they are mentioning while they're in that state. You essentially have a conversation with that person. Then you have them come back to the waking state and their symptoms are gone. And there's video proof of these things happening. You know, it's ridiculous. I'll try to find a video and put it on the screen if I can find it.
In the past, hypnosis has been used for pain relief for the most part. At present, it's still used for that. We've added the ability to discover unconscious fears, too, which we'll mention if we have time. In obstetrics, it's the safest way of delivering a baby, safe to the mother, safe to the baby.
This is natural childbirth?
Natural childbirth, Grantley Dick Reed didn't recognize at first was hypnosis. The dissociation of thought away from the abdomen while they're relaxing their arms. This is a trick. I've just mentioned it with Mrs. Ely. In the old days, they used it when they had no anesthetics. Now we use it for the patient who cannot take an anesthetic safely. This is relatively seldom. more important to find out what the fears are of the surgical patient. And anesthetists are discovering that they can talk to the surgical patient in deep surgical anesthesia and have them carry out suggestions just as though hypnotized. This is an interesting area. More important probably than that, though, is the discovery that they can control bleeding. They're able to control salivation. The dentists have taught us much about this. It's easier to work in a dry mouth than a wet one.
Yes.
It's very valuable for the critically ill patient. And Esdale, whom we had down there in India, who had done the 3,000 operations, discovered this tremendous capacity of the unconscious to protect and do the right thing. It dropped his mortality from 50% to 5%. There's something that we need to know more about in this deep hypnotic state that can be helpful. And these critically ill seem to understand this need and use it. In psychiatry, it is becoming more and more used as a means of breaking through the blocks that patients sometimes get. And by using questioning techniques such as the pendulum or the little finger signals, we can get at material often that is blocked by the other ways, and this can shorten the therapy.
Breuer calls this the talking cure, which Freud will take that terminology as well and develop the very basis of modern psychotherapy. Freud comes on the scene, he's mentored by Breuer, and he's a hypnotist. But what he eventually figures out is that he's not very good at hypnotizing people. So what he devises is a new method, again, a talking cure, but this time without the hypnotism. But in reality, it's still there. It's just not consciously being induced. The hypnosis in this case is by virtue of the power dynamic between the woman who has hysteria and the psychoanalyst, along with the environment. We have to remember that people in this time are living in a very sexually conservative culture, and Freud's patients were generally upper-class women who had been very protected throughout their lives. Just to be alone in a room with a man who was very high status, in a room decorated with fine art, you're laying on a couch, you're told to relax, right? This is already kind of a psychologically altering environment. It would be for anyone. I want to briefly mention this is no different than psychotherapeutic environments today. They're made to cultivate a certain experience. So this sounds all great, except Freud is missing one key component. What do you do? What do you do now that you're in this environment? You have the person relaxed. What is the method that you use to help that person cure? So here it is, really one of the most important discoveries of modern psychology and psychotherapy in general. It's actually discovered by one of Freud's patients, not himself. Her name was Anna O, the infamous Anna O. She suggested to Freud that they simply talked about her current emotional state, moving backward in time, finding each moment she felt the same way. You go back and essentially you're collecting these disparate memories that are related to each other based on their emotional charge. She called this process chimney sweeping, and Freud noticed that this resulted in a cathartic release for his clients. And this will form the basis of his theory of complexes, which are essentially a collection of memories around a certain emotional experience. Today we really call this modern therapy. It is threading the connection between a bunch of these similar events in our lives, trying to understand the causality, the causal chain, because we understand ourselves as a product of our past experiences, which is something that Jung is going to fight against. But again, this is a Freudian perspective. So now we're getting into the juicy stuff here and how Jung's perspective is going to differ from Freud's, specifically on the concept of trauma. There are two main things that Jung is going to draw from and really isolate out of the history of psychoanalysis up to this point. One is this idea that when there is a psychological disconnect between what is essentially a group of memories and the normal state, you can have tension between those two, that one can cause symptoms in the other. And so he starts to kind of develop this theory that some form of unity is really important for psychological health. The second thing he takes away, which is from Freud, but also from the hypnotists, is that the person themselves has the key to their own psychological health. Anna O was the one who knew how she could heal people. It wasn't Freud that discovered modern psychotherapy, it was Anna O. And guys like Pussegor, guys like Gassner, and guys like Charcot noticed a similar trend, where the client so often knew the solution to their own problems, but they just couldn't connect with it. So they had to enter that altered state. And in that altered state, they could figure out and kind of take this third-party view of their own issues and solve them. And of course, this makes sense because nobody knows their problems better than the client themselves. And even in today's form of therapy, the therapist is never going to tell you what to do, right? Because how would they know what it is that you need to do? Their purpose is to guide you to find your own solutions. So how does this manifest itself in a new understanding of psychopathology at this point? What is the difference between Freud's understanding of human beings being a direct result of this causal chain of events that leads to their current psychological state? How does Jung differ from this? Jung essentially mentions the trauma equation, and this is an equation that remains unsolved today. So you have the event, which is only a potential trigger. Any event can actually be a traumatic event, and traumatic events can happen in the positive direction. But you don't seek therapy for those, you seek therapy for the negative ones. The event is an unspecific trigger. It's an ambiguous thing that can either be good or be bad. It can result in trauma or not. And so really the unknown piece of this equation is what Jung calls the predisposition. And there have been many answers to this question. Is it a genetic predisposition? Is it a social construct? Is it a cultural situation that the person finds themselves in that makes them susceptible to being traumatized in this way? Is it a religious factor or a moral factor? We see that the moral factor is a huge one for a very long time. It's like this person is bad, and that's why they develop these symptoms. The devil is after them because they're essentially less good or have opened the door to the devil. So Jung's answer to this question, and I think it is completely undersold in modern therapy and modern psychology, is that each event in our lives is actually an opportunity for unconscious content to be conscious, to become conscious. In other words, an internal psychological dynamic will be projected onto the traumatic event in order for it to be realized by consciousness. It's essentially saying that there is some type of tension that lies beneath the surface of the conscious mind, and any event can serve as receiving that projection. There are important things to consider in this in modern day. Really the question that he's asking and that gets him to this conclusion is, how do you account for two people? Sometimes they're genetically identical. You take twins that grow up in the same household, but by the age 18, one has schizophrenia, the other doesn't. One has developed a mood disorder or a personality disorder, the other hasn't, despite sharing the same genetic information and nearly an identical environment. He posits this as the answer, and as we'll see, it's very complicated, and there's a lot of stuff to discuss about it, and we'll get to that in the later chapters. So here's another representation that I created to help explain this concept, and really we're going to focus on Eros, and that's the topic of the next chapter, his own theory of this psychological kind of motivating force that he calls Eros. And so the conflicts that are within the psyche are primarily erotic conflicts that manifest themselves in a projection onto any physical event that we have, and it can be co-opted as a normal or traumatizing event. And the purpose of the symptom, the purpose of the trauma is actually the goal of bringing those two pieces closer together for psychological unity, for wholeness, for individuation. So to really drive this point home, I'm going to read directly from the book and have him explain it in his own words. He says, "We have learned that the trauma, the ostensible cause of the illness, is no more than an occasion for something previously not conscious to manifest itself, in essence, as an important erotic conflict. Accordingly, the trauma loses its exclusive significance and is replaced by a much deeper and more comprehensible conception, which sees the pathogenic agent as an erotic conflict." Then he asks this question, why should the erotic conflict be the cause? And he concludes, and this is based off of his years of doing therapy, that it is so frequently a deeper conflict that is involved in the person's psychopathology, not something that's at the surface. Then he mentions this point, which is really the key component of analytical psychology, what differs it from almost every other type of psychology. For with this discovery, that not the trauma but a hidden erotic conflict is the root of the neurosis, the trauma loses its causal significance. What he's done here, and it's amazing, and really it is freeing. What he has done is he's broken the causal chain, and really what is a myth, he would say, that we are a product of all the events that happen to us. What he's basically saying is, no, you are not a product of the chain of events that led to you. You get to determine how you interpret those chain of events, right? But the interpretation is based on unconscious tensions and conflicts that we have yet to explore in this video series. That will be in the next chapters. The next chapter, and specifically, like I said, covers the Eros Theory, which is going to take us from the first renditions of gods all the way to these psychological archetypes and concepts. This video has been a little bit less editing than I usually do, and so I hope that it was still enjoyable. And if you like the series and want me to make more videos in this vein, please let me know in the comment section down below. And of course, subscribe for the continuation of this series. I'll see you guys on the next one.